Welcome to the Healthy Skin Show with Jennifer Fugo, where we're flipping everything you've been told about your chronic skin issues upside down and connecting you with alternative solutions your dermatologist never told you about.
Welcome back to episode number 270 of the Healthy Skin Show. In today's episode, I'm offering a response to a question that I commonly get. Is the low histamine diet good for skin rashes? What makes this question relevant now is that I find more functional practitioners and doctors are recommending a low histamine diet more frequently. And that's fine, assuming two things. One, the diet is warranted given a deep review of the case. And two, the diet is generally used as a bridge to manage symptoms while working on other deeper problems lurking under the surface so that you can eventually transition off of the diet. And the reason I explicitly state that you should eventually transition to a broader diet is that the low histamine diet is extremely difficult to follow. It can also result in a deep, near hatred of food for some individuals. I believe I shared in another episode that most people whom I've worked with have admitted to me that after doing the low histamine diet, they would prefer not to eat if they didn't have to. And that's an unfortunate and concerning reality for people to find themselves in, which at this point in time hasn't completely sunk in within many practitioner circles. I'm not saying that you should avoid this diet at all costs, but the question I shared at the beginning of this episode, specifically, is the low histamine diet good for skin rashes, isn't the right question to ask. It's not a matter of whether a low histamine diet is good for skin rashes. Instead, it's a question of whether a low histamine diet is necessary and appropriate. And figuring that out is the crucial piece. It's not a diet to just try because you're trying to rule things out or bring inflammation down. Because if you don't have a histamine intolerance or even something that I call histamine overload, and I've talked about that on the show, then this likely isn't the right intervention to try. So let's talk about those two criteria I mentioned to help you figure out if doing a low histamine diet is the next best step for you. The first point I made earlier is that there has to be a clear reason present to even start the low histamine diet. It's not a diet that you pick on a whim or try just because your health isn't what you want it to be. A low histamine diet will generally be helpful if you struggle with histamine intolerance or, as I described, a situation called histamine overload, and you can find more about histamine overload in episode 188. Certain types of rashes will likely improve more so with a low histamine diet, and those include chronic hives, urticaria, dermatographia, angioedema, and even histamine-driven eczema cases. Though I do want to put a little caveat here, and I shared in episode 248, not all eczema cases are histamine-driven, and in fact, most are not. This all said, assessing a case for histamine overload is extremely important because certain situations can look a lot like a histamine problem when it's actually not. And an example of this would be topical steroid withdrawal, where it's often confused for severe eczema or histamine intolerance. So getting assessed for histamine intolerance or histamine overload is crucial before bothering to dive into a low histamine diet. If you do not have someone to help you figure out if a low histamine diet would be helpful, you can actually check out a list of concerns and symptoms that I listed in episode 188 of the Healthy Skin Show on histamine intolerance and skin rashes, part 1. Because, and I need to be brutally honest here, a low histamine diet is pretty awful. I generally feel bad suggesting it to a client and will oftentimes try to find the quote-unquote lightest version of the diet that will get results. So no, you don't need to cut everything out and strictly do a low histamine diet. It may not be a requirement for every single case, but that's based on the severity. And there are variations to this that I will implement in my practice, where we might start by removing the foods with the largest histamine content and see if that improves symptoms first. Things that we'll exclude could be alcohol, fermented foods like vinegars, kombucha, soy sauce, sauerkraut, kimchi, aged cheeses, cured meats, bone broth, strawberries, spinach, tomatoes, chocolate, coffee. Coffee is the one potential exception where sometimes people can actually tolerate coffee from a company called Purity. And it may be tolerable for them, but that would be one minute exception. If more is needed, then you dive a bit deeper and try removing other foods that may be problematic, like leftovers, protein powders, collagen, gelatin, dried spices, and even fish, unless it was very quickly frozen after being caught. And if you still need to go further, then we're looking at the list of other possibly problematic foods like citrus or bananas, which, believe it or not, don't actually contain high levels of histamine in them, but may be an issue for some and are often listed as being high in histamine on various websites. The truth is that if you find this conversation confusing about which foods are best to avoid on a low histamine diet, you are not alone. This episode is brought to you by my skincare line, DermaQuell. The beauty of these skincare products are that they are especially crafted for those struggling with chronic skin rash issues based on my research and clinical experience from my private practice. They focus on organic ingredients that are clean like zinc, aloe, and hemp oil that support and calm rashed, dry, angry skin. There's no unnecessary chemicals or additives that can further dry out your skin or mess with your hormones. And I'm so excited for you to add these creams into your routine. Check them out at quellshop.com and use the coupon code GET15OFF to get 15% off your first order. I'll put a link in the description below, and now let's jump back to the video. There's not a great deal of science behind these lists, so while some items like fermented foods make a lot of sense, some other items might not. I should also add that diet changes may be more successful with the addition of certain supportive supplements like immunoglobulins, bioflavonoids, and quercetin. And while antihistamines may be helpful, long-term use of these medications, even those that are over the counter, can also have some concerning potential side effects. So if you know that it's highly likely that you have histamine intolerance or histamine overload, and you are doing the low histamine diet right now, are you looking for and dealing with the underlying drivers of the condition? Now, too many people assume that they have a DAO enzyme deficiency, which I don't think is nearly as common as is claimed online. And because people may feel somewhat better on a low histamine diet, there's also this dangerous temptation for some to just continue eating that way. However, I find that the diet is, as I've already stated, difficult to sustain due to the amount of restriction and leads to disordered eating patterns, food fear, and even in some cases, disgust of food or even just disgust of having to eat at all. On top of which, there can be a sense of tremendous social isolation, feeling like you're doomed, and really experiencing a lot of depression that negatively impacts your quality of life. That's why I view the low histamine diet as a band-aid. It can certainly be helpful for those really struggling with intense symptoms, but it ultimately will not fix the underlying problem. And for most, there's something else going on under the surface and or in the environment, like mold exposure, which is why your histamine reactivity is so high and pronounced. The diet itself must be coupled with a plan to investigate underlying triggers as well as a roadmap to start dealing with them. Ultimately, I like to start food reintroduction attempts with those higher histamine foods within 2 to 4 months after beginning a low histamine diet. This assumes, though, that the individual's supplement support is dialed in and the client is feeling better as we continue to reduce the deeper root causes. Now, if you're listening to this thinking that you will always be stuck on the low histamine diet forever and haven't delved into the potential issues surrounding histamine overload, I'd highly recommend that you dig deeper into the many resources that I've created for you here on the Healthy Skin Show. This is a very common problem that I work with in my private virtual clinic, so it's something we assess for from the start. I think that histamine intolerance is actually a bigger, broader issue, which I call histamine overload, and it explains why people don't always get better and may get stuck on an overly restrictive diet. As a rule of thumb, more food restrictions in general do not necessarily equate to being healthy. The decision to remove specific foods ultimately comes down to a variety of factors, including whether the shifts are necessary and warranted, while at the same time looking for the reasons beyond the food itself that could be driving the problems in the first place. So before you jump on the low histamine diet bandwagon or take advice to do this diet from what you're reading online, consider what I've shared with you today so that you can make a more informed decision based on the specifics in your case. Now, if you've got any questions or thoughts to share about this particular topic, or you want to see all the resources I've linked up for you to help you figure all this out, head on over to skinterrupt.com/270. That way we can keep the conversation going. If you find this episode fascinating and helpful, please make a point to share this with fellow skin rash warriors who might not realize that there is a lot more to consider before diving headfirst into a low histamine diet, or who are feeling trapped and thinking that they have to stay on a low histamine diet forever. And before we part ways today, it takes just a moment to rate and review the Healthy Skin Show over on iTunes or your podcast platform of choice. Then hit that subscribe button so you can tune in each week for new research, clinical tips and strategies just like this, personal stories, and inspiration that you need on your journey to rebuild healthy skin. And then let's connect over on social media as well as Instagram. I'm at Jennifer Fugo. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I look forward to digging deeper with you in the next episode.